What's going on? This is Pseychie, and after a couple weeks of procrastination, I finally decided to make another video. I promised myself I was gonna make one before the end of February, but then I realized there's only 28 days of February, so this will probably come out in the beginning of March, just in time for the new Castlevania DLC, by the way. And just before that, I wanted to get in one more showcase, since we'll probably have an influx of new weapons to play with. So today, I want to take a look at the new and improved Gilded Yumi. This is a weapon that was buffed in a patch. Before the buff, I'm just gonna be blunt, I feel like the weapon was unusable. The Gilded Yumi, its current state, will push back any enemies in its path until it hits a wall, or at least it travels for a very, very long distance. In fact, so long that it pretty much travels off the screen. Now, I really like it when new weapons in Dead Cells do this, but basically just go all out on the wackiness scale, push enemies off screen, that's really fun, and I wish like the knockback shield would do something similar. But this is a new version of the Gilded Yumi. It's only got 2 shots, but usually those 2 shots are more than enough to take care of everything that's unfortunate enough to get in its way. Before the buff, the Yumi had 4 ammo, I believe, and the pushback was nowhere near as effective as it is now. It had a lower draw speed, and I just didn't really see what purpose it served before. But now I can safely say the Gilded Yumi is a very unique weapon among tactics. And in a second there, I'm going to pair it up with the marksman's bow, which I believe I already showcased once on this channel. But now that we have new support for the bow, I'm going to be a little bit creative and see just how much damage this can dish out. And I was very pleasantly surprised, because this build has probably one of the most unique playstyles I've ever experienced in the game. So in my last marksman's bow showcase, I paired it up with the war javelin, which is a quirky weapon, but I thought it was a little bit awkward since you had to teleport to the javelin after you knock back enemies with it, and I just found it a little bit hard to work with. But now with the Gilded Yumi, you can safely push back any targets and you don't have to travel with the bow. And at the same time, the Yumi will actually crit if it happens to hit an enemy against something else in its way. So you don't actually strictly need a wall or like a vertical surface in order for it to get value. As long as there's 2 enemies lined up for you, you'll still be able to crit with it, which I think is a fantastic thing to have. When it's something that I wish the hand hook would also do, but unfortunately it doesn't do that. So you shoot out the bow and it's essentially a death cannon. It will knock back everything in its path and you don't have to worry about it. There is a small wind-up time, which I think balances out pretty well, and there was a time during its alpha stages where you could actually get more than 2 shots, which is absolutely broken. So right now, the Gilded Yumi can only have a maximum of 2 shots. You cannot have any more than that. The ammo mutation doesn't work, and you can't get any extra shots on affixes. It's kind of in a special place since you could use it as a main weapon or you can use it as support. So for this build, I'm going to be using the marksman's bow. The marksman's bow crits on enemies that are far away. So in this case, I picked up Tranquility, which states that you deal more damage when enemies are far away. And the Gilded Yumi is just exceptional at helping the marksman's bow trigger the crit condition. So against enemies that teleport, you really don't want them to be near you when you're playing tactics, so you can just safely fire the Yumi and then everything is knockback. So this is still me kind of experimenting around with the Gilded Yumi, as I've never really played this weapon extensively, and you'll see me kind of run into some trouble with timings, as I'm not too familiar with the Yumi's attack speed, and that will get me into trouble every now and then. I have tested a little bit in the training room, just to kind of get a feel what kind of situations is the Yumi good for, and what kind of boss I should route to make the most use out of this cool new death cannon. Well, luckily, there's no enemy in the game that's immune to knockback. You have some enemies immune to stun, or freeze, or root. The Yumi, everything can be knocked back. It's pretty much fair game. And just around these parts, you'll see some really cool shots of me just basically pushing back all the enemies on a platform, and then just wiping them out in one go, just like that. So I think it has some serious crowd clearing potential, and what's even more interesting is that I actually would have expected it that if you shot like a buzz cutter with it, it would have just bounced them into the wall, but if you actually shoot at a flying enemy, they will just die instantly. So right there in the transition room, I made a careful choice of going into the bank, and then of course you'll see me mess up, but that's okay. I don't think anyone should be expected to play perfectly. These things happen. So it was either Morass of the Banish or it was the bank. And I actually had to sit quite a long time to decide which biome I wanted to go to, which is not something I do very often. but I do appreciate Dead Cells for these rare moments where you do have to sit down and then really consider which biome to go to if you wanted to get the maximum use out of your weapons. So I thought that this weapon can probably handle the bank, and it will probably give me a little bit more gold than had I gone to Morass. But I would definitely consider the bank to be one of the harder biomes in the game, mainly because of those gold gorgers. They have been nerfed in the past, but it's still just such a big menace to deal with. Like, you kind of have to prioritize them before every other enemy, and if you manage to be a little bit late, then they'll transform into these giant variants, and it's just such a pain to deal with because they'll also teleport to you and everything. So when I was testing out some builds in the training room, I decided that Cocoon would be a really good fit for this build, as it would allow me to quickly respond to any kind of enemies that somehow make it past my defenses. Like if I think the Yumi is not fast enough to knock back an enemy, due to its draw speed, I could just have a quick solution to parry it away. Of course, my other choice was to use Foresight with the diverse deck, but unfortunately I believe I accidentally locked it in custom mode. And I honestly think Foresight is like a really cheat way to make the game easier. So I really think they're gonna do something to change the diverse deck, at least in a way to make it less broken than it is now. So as I was doing the run, I considered what kind of bosses are suitable for the Gilded Yumi. Obviously I'm not going to Concierge because you just don't get a lot of rewards for going there. And I tried to use the Yumi on Conjunctivius, but I just had a really rough time with it in the training room. So that's the reason I decided to go Mama Tick. Sure, she will kind of punish you from being far away by throwing bombs at you, but you can still get a lot of mileage out of the marksman's bow as well as the Yumi. And this part of the biome is kind of how I get frustrated with going to the bank a lot, is again those gold gorgers. So you can kind of see one that's really off to the side, and I really want to go and prioritize killing the gold gorger above everything else. So as you can see, it turns into this giant variant in its third stage, and it just gives you a huge headache that you have to deal with. So that's kind of just the main concern of going to the bank. But other than that, I really like the aesthetics of this biome. Right after I cover content for the new Castlevania DLC, I actually plan on making an updated biome guide. Because now, ever since my last one in 2021, there's now been a plethora of new biomes that we can play with. So there's Queen and the Sea, obviously, and then there is the bank, and then there's also the upcoming Castlevania, which by the time this video is released, which is probably gonna come out at around a week from now. So when the time comes, I do plan on doing a live stream of me just blindly reacting to the new DLC. It's been like over a year since I did my last one. I believe the last live stream I've done was for Queen and the Sea, which is literally over a year ago. Alright, so we're fighting Mama Tick now. There's not too much you can do in this fight other than just be far away and then fire in your shots. But one thing I have noticed is that one of the disadvantages of pairing up the Yumi with the marksman's bow is that the Yumi has way too much range. Like, it's going to push targets off the screen, and the marksman's bow actually does not fire that far. Surprisingly, even though its crit condition is that enemies have to be far away from you. And another thing I want to commend the Yumi for is its potential to stun. So, as you can see there, you can actually safely interrupt Mama Tick's attacks by just shooting a Yumi shot at her. So when she comes up, I'm just trying to bait out the melee strike because it's just really easy to parry. And then you can interrupt a lot of her attacks just by using the Gilded Yumi, which I found to be pretty interesting. So we're gonna dodge one more attack, and then it's just one more barrage of my death cannon, and Mama Tick will be down. So that's a flawless fight. And moving on, since we're playing the Gilded Yumi, it only makes sense that we go to Fractured Shrines where there's a lot of aerial combat. It just makes things a lot more interesting, and it looks pretty goofy when you hit an enemy and then it just flies off screen and then it just dies somewhere. And then you'll see me have a huge blunder here, getting myself hit from a series of attacks. Definitely was not feeling my A game there, but I decided to just go with it. Since I'm going to be getting the curse, I thought it didn't make too much sense to heal myself at this point. And since I used up all of my money for the flask in the bank, I decided to just tough it out after the curse. Since if you're cursed, you're dead in one hit anyway, so it really doesn't matter how much health you have. And then something interesting I found is that at least in the Fractured Shrines, if you hit an enemy and then it flies off into the air, and I think it would be what the game considers to be out of bound, the enemy will just die instantly. You don't really see this a lot. It might not be as apparent as I make it out to be, but if you shoot at an enemy, it flies off the screen into like the air. They just kind of die instantly, even though I'm positively sure they didn't hit a surface. And I know a lot of tactics builds tend to one-shot a lot of enemies, but the Gilded Yumi kind of does that in a unique way, as it doesn't actually do the damage on contact. On the contrary, if you hit an enemy and it doesn't bounce off of anything, the Yumi does relatively little damage. The real damage comes when you actually hit the target against another surface. And what's unique about this build in particular, same goes for the last time I tried out the marksman's bow, is that you actually have to pick out your biomes. As some biomes have just really long corridors, such as the ossuary. I generally don't go to ossuary anyways. I just find it a lot of fun to knock things off screen, and it's a playstyle that I don't get to experience very often. But something else that's also pretty cool is that you can actually put the Gilded Yumi in your backpack, and if you use Acrobat Pack, then I believe it will actually knock back enemies. Sure, it won't do as much damage, but it's still really good support. And it's one of the few weapons that are actually good with Acrobat Pack. So you just see some footage of me firing the Yumi and then getting everything. So here's a montage of me using the Yumi just by releasing an arrow, and then watch everything get blasted backwards. One thing I will say is that the Yumi's arrow will travel in a straight line, so it doesn't have very good auto-targeting potential. So for situations where a target is like one platform above me, you can actually just use the marksman's bow, because the auto-targeting on that is a lot better than the Yumi. Like, you kind of have to line up all the targets in a horizontal line before firing, but you don't have that problem with the marksman's bow. So you can probably see some of the out of bounds mechanics I was talking about here. If you knock enemies out of bounds, you just get the gold right away when they die. And the Stone Titan is probably one of the few enemies that can't be knocked back. And I'm gonna get a legendary flamethrower turret. I forgot if I showed the affixes, but it had a self-synergizing poison affix, which I thought is really nice. And then I killed the second Stone Titan, and I could have sworn this room wasn't here before, with a single chest there. I used to think that the second Stone Titan didn't have a treasure vault at all, where it would just lead to a lore room. And then here I made a judgment to fight Timekeeper. The reason for this is that, well, the giant can't be knocked back, so the Yumi and the marksman's bow will do like literally no damage. I tried out fighting the Scarecrow in the training room. I might show some footage of me attempting that, but I just find that Scarecrow tends to stick to you like glue, and it's really hard to knock the boss back where you could get value from marksman's bow, which meant the only boss that's left that kind of makes this build really good in is Timekeeper. This biome is not one that I come very often, but it's still a biome that I'm willing to go to if the situation arises. And plus, the vertical aspect of this biome just makes it really easy to knock things in the walls. And then of course, 90% of my damage comes from stupid mistakes, but I overall didn't have too much trouble with this biome at this point of the game. But even then, like even at the beginning of the run, I was not having any trouble at all. And then you'll really see the full potential of the Gilded Yumi here, where if there is more than one enemy on a single platform, then one shot is more than plenty to take them out. So I think if you rock the Gilded Yumi, you can have a lot of fun with it. It's definitely come a long way from its first version, which was terrible, by the way. But now it has a lot of flavors in how you can play it. It also has some cool decision making that you have to take when considering which bosses are good against the Gilded Yumi. So we're gonna enter the Timekeeper fight, and Timekeeper is actually gonna be a pretty squishy boss here. Just by firing the Yumi once, just waiting for opportunities to attack, you can get in so much damage here. So Timekeeper is probably the only second tier boss where it's okay to have like a range setup. The boss does not tend to stick to you at melee range. And yes, I'm gonna unfortunately lose the no-hit here and be on relatively little health. I also tested out this next portion of the run against the servants in the training room, and I actually found it to be pretty good. So I decided to take up the challenge and go to the Queen in the Sea area. So entering the infested shipwreck, and of course that was the one position where you get a free ticket to a ground slam full of spikes. So again, really stupid mistakes, but fortunately I do have the extended healing perk, which allows me to heal up 80% of my health. But as I was saying, I do like the aesthetics of the infested shipwreck. My only gripe with it is that it is so big. It's such a big biome. And not only that, the shop items here is not even the highest tier. So it's actually like a tier lower than the cavern, which I think just makes no sense, because this is the biome right before the final bosses. But there's a lot of verticality here, and one thing that it does really well in is it's so good at clearing platforms. It's one of those biomes where you have those coral-like platforms, where if enemies throw a bomb or like an anchor throws a bomb at it, then it just breaks. And it can actually mess up your entire rhythm every now and then, because I find the best strategy is to just DPS them down before they even attack. And the Gilded Yumi surprisingly does that really well. So against a lot of these elites, you just kind of go down, fire at will, and it's not a problem. Like, some of the enemies in this biome have ridiculously quick detection times. Like those pirate captains will fire a bomb at you like as soon as they see you. Even if you happen to be really fast, it's just a lot to deal with, and especially with those cannons, you have to dodge them. You could parry them actually, but then they'll just keep firing it at you. But overall, I do think the pirate captains is one of the most annoying enemies in the game. But I do like the fact that they were ported over from Still Village, because I do believe that's the first biome where they were introduced in. I really like the concept of reusing different mobs in different biomes where it would be seen as suitable. And then this giant room here is one of the prime examples of just the definition of things going wrong really fast. So as soon as I couldn't take out a platform of enemies, I knew I had to get out of there and recover, because these different cannons and bombs are breaking the coral platforms left and right, which means you have a really weak foothold of where you can and cannot stand. Instead of playing it risky, my response is to just run back to like the beginning of the platform, where you can kind of wait for everything to teleport to you, and then you can just get rid of everything right then and there. So yeah, we're pretty much at the end of the road here. Enjoy some final footage of me clearing the shipwreck, and we're gonna move on to the lighthouse. So I practiced this boss fight a little bit in the training room, and I find that the best strategy, at least the strategy that I went with when climbing the lighthouse, is to just ignore the enemies. So for a lot of builds, I tend to sneak in attacks every now and then when I believe I'm about to get hit by the mace servants. But for this build specifically, because the Gilded Yumi has a longer than usual draw speed, I'm only going to sneak in attacks if I absolutely believe it is safe to do so. And an interesting tip about Calliope is that she has 3 different directional long-range attacks. So she can actually launch the mace horizontally, vertically, or diagonally at a 45 degrees angle. So if she happens to be initiating an attack while she's like 45 degrees to you, or right across or below you, then you can kind of predict what kind of attack it's going to be, and you can actually just safely dodge it. So for the upcoming second portion of the climb, I'm going to try to shave off some health from Calliope to make the boss fight a little bit easier, but when Euterpe shows up, I'm just gonna book it. Something that's really unfortunate in this fight is that you really don't want to take damage. You do get a little bit of food right before the second boss fight, but I don't think it's that significant. Because if you take damage like once, especially in a tactics build, the majority of your health is gone, and it's really hard to land rally points, since doing so would just put you in risk of taking even more damage. So we're gonna go into the second boss fight now, and then I'm just gonna take it nice and slow. Because I find that one of the best strategies in the Servant's boss fight is to just take it nice and easy. I'm just gonna let my legendary flamethrower turret do some of the work. Of course, if a Servant were to be too close for comfort, you can just knock them back with the Gilded Yumi. So this portion of the fight will go a little bit slower than the solo fight from Calliope, and I think the key aspect here is to just be patient. When the Servants all attack you at once, it may seem pretty frantic, but I find that just by clearing your head and then knowing what Servant is capable of, the fight is not that bad actually. In fact, it's probably one of my favorite fights in the game. The one aspect that I kinda dislike about it is in the last portion of the fight, you're gonna meet Kaleo, who's gonna use the Tonfas against you. And let me tell you, Kaleo's attacks hurt. Like, a lot. So much that I think the damage can actually be toned down a little bit. I'm not sure if it's a thing because of the melees, as if you have more melees, you actually take more damage. But even then, I just feel like the damage Kaleo does is just way too out of whack. So this part of the chase is especially important because you definitely don't want to get hit by Kaleo here. So at this point, I'm just like, yeah, I've had my fun. I don't really care about damaging the servants anymore, just get me out of here. And as you can see, with all three of them chasing you at once, it can seem a little bit frantic. But you can just find shortcuts here and there. You can do the wall climb. Don't go for the ladders, I want to say, because you have to climb up the ladders and the animation is pretty slow. So we're gonna get into the final fight. And what I like to do, just going into the beginning of the final servants fight, I just draw my turret and then you just jump up to the platform above you, because I find Cleo will always open with that triple slash attack. So we're making some short work of the servants here. The Gilded Yumi, surprisingly, is really good in this fight. The servants are squishy enough so that they can actually be knocked back. But again, one of the major gripes I have is that Cleo just does way too much damage. But I guess that's just the demerit of running tactics. And then I decided to do the really risky move of healing here. And I don't know if you saw that, but if Cleo was just a little bit lower, I probably would have died there. But I mean, that's just kind of the nature of the game. You're always living right on the edge, right? So once that's taken care of, all that's left to do is to just play the waiting game. And then for some reason, some of my marksman's bow shots didn't happen to find their marks. But I finally was able to finish the fight. So close to the no-hit, I will get there someday. And finally, we're at the last stop. So against the queen, I'm fairly confident I can do this, especially that I have the cocoon, which is actually an incredibly useful tool in this fight. So just like the scarecrow, the queen tends to stick to you very closely, but at the same time, you can kind of get her far away if you know what you're doing. But one thing I noticed is that right after you parry one of her attacks, she will almost always step backwards. So that can kind of give you some breathing room, and it's one of the main reasons why a shield is just so good in this fight. So this legendary flamethrower turret is doing some serious work here. So it not only does it have oil, it also has poison. And then when she does these reality slices, one of Tactic's really strong points is to still be able to attack her while she's doing it. So I'm just gonna fire off some marksman's bow shots, and I'm gonna feature the cocoon here, because you can actually parry the reality slices with the cocoon, and doing so will actually damage her at the same time, which is just ridiculously overpowered. So nothing to it, and that is a flawless queen fight. So I hope you've enjoyed this really unique setup I have with the Gilded Yumi. Definitely try it out for yourself, you are in for a blast. So I'm looking forward to the new upcoming Castlevania DLC, and I will see you all when the update drops.